Did Susan Smith really believe her lies would hold forever? This is the story of a young woman whose life spiraled into tragedy and deception, shocking a nation and leaving an indelible mark on those who knew her. Susan Smith's story begins in Union, South Carolina, a small town where she was born into a life of quiet struggle, marked by loss, heartbreak, and an unrelenting search for love and acceptance. Susan's childhood. Born on September 26, 1971, Susan Lee Vaughn was the youngest of 3 children in a household that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. However, her family life was anything but. Her father, Harry Vaughn Jr., was a man plagued by financial difficulties and emotional instability. Susan's parents' marriage was rocky, filled with frequent arguments and tension that trickled down to the children. When Susan was just 6 years old, her father ended his life. The trauma of this loss was profound, leaving Susan grappling with feelings of abandonment and confusion. Her mother, Linda, was left to raise the children on her own. However, she soon remarried a successful local businessman named Beverly Russell. His wealth brought financial stability to the family, but the emotional scars of Harry's death lingered, especially for Susan. Family life and her mother's remarriage. Linda's marriage to Bev Russell seemed like a step forward for the Vaughn family. They moved into a more comfortable home, and the children began to experience a life that was more secure than before. Yet, the new family dynamic was far from perfect. Susan craved attention and struggled to find her place in the blended household. Bev was an influential figure in the local church and the community, but behind closed doors, he had his own demons. As Susan entered her teenage years, Bev began to exhibit inappropriate behavior toward her, a fact that would later come to light in her life story. This betrayal of trust would leave Susan feeling even more isolated and confused, deepening her insecurities. Teenage years and high school. In high school, Susan was bright and charismatic, but often felt like an outsider. She excelled academically and participated in various school activities, earning the admiration of her teachers. Despite this, Susan struggled to fit in socially. She sought validation through relationships, often dating older men who she believed could provide the stability and love she desperately needed. Susan's need for affection and attention became a defining feature of her personality. Friends recalled her as someone who seemed desperate for approval, a young woman who would do anything to avoid rejection. Her self-esteem was fragile, and she constantly worried about her image and what others thought of her. Meeting David Smith. After graduating from high school, Susan began working at a local grocery store, where she met David Smith. David was a charming and easygoing man who quickly captured Susan's attention. The two started dating, and Susan believed she had finally found someone who could fill the void left by her troubled childhood. David, like Susan, had his own struggles. He came from a modest background and had dreams of building a stable future. Their relationship was intense and moved quickly. In 1991, they got married, and Susan hoped this union would bring her the happiness and security she had always craved. Married life and struggles. The early years of Susan and David's marriage were marked by ups and downs. They welcomed 2 sons, Michael and Alexander, who became the center of Susan's world. However, their marriage was far from perfect. David's long work hours and Susan's emotional instability created tension. She began to feel neglected, and her old insecurities resurfaced. Susan also struggled with financial pressures and the realities of motherhood. The weight of her unfulfilled dreams and her tumultuous past bore down on her, leading to frequent arguments with David. The couple separated multiple times, and Susan began seeking attention outside of her marriage, desperate for love. During one of their separations, Susan started an affair with Tom Finley, the son of her wealthy employer. Tom was everything Susan aspired to have: successful, confident, and from a privileged background. Susan became infatuated with him, convinced that he could offer her the life she had always dreamed of. However, Tom eventually ended the relationship, citing Susan's instability and the complications of her being a mother. This rejection was a crushing blow for Susan. It reignited the feelings of abandonment she had experienced throughout her life. Desperate to win Tom back and reclaim a sense of control, Susan's thoughts turned dark, leading her down a path of lies and devastating consequences. Did Susan Smith really think the truth wouldn't come out? The unthinkable crime. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith made a decision that would shock the world. After strapping her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, into their car seats, she drove to John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina. She stopped at a boat ramp, got out of the car, released the handbrake, and watched as the vehicle rolled into the water, her 2 young boys trapped inside. As the car disappeared beneath the surface, Susan began to construct the story she would tell, a story of a kidnapping by an unknown man. She then ran to a nearby house, hysterical, claiming that a black man had carjacked her at gunpoint and driven off with her children. The lie. Susan's lie was detailed and calculated. She described the supposed carjacker as a tall black man wearing a knit cap, feeding into racial stereotypes that fueled widespread media attention. Susan's tearful pleas on national television captured the sympathy of millions. She appeared at press conferences, sobbing as she begged for her children's safe return. Her performance was so convincing that even David, her estranged husband, stood by her side, believing her every word. The community of Union rallied around Susan, organizing searches and vigils, desperate to find Michael and Alexander. The truth unravels. As the days turned into weeks, law enforcement began to notice inconsistencies in Susan's story. Her timeline didn't add up, and her demeanor shifted in private interviews. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after the disappearance of her children, Susan confessed. In a chilling statement, she admitted to driving her car into the lake with her children inside. Her reason? She claimed she was overwhelmed by depression and felt unworthy of being a mother. However, prosecutors argued that her real motive was selfish. She believed her children were an obstacle to rekindling her romance with Tom Findlay, who had expressed disinterest in dating a woman with children. The trial. Susan Smith was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. Her trial began in 1995, and it captivated the nation. The prosecution painted her as a cold and calculating murderer, driven by selfish desires. The defense, however, argued that Susan was mentally ill, citing her troubled upbringing, the trauma of her father ending his own life, and alleged abuse by her stepfather, Bev Russell. The jury ultimately rejected her defense of diminished capacity. On July 22, 1995, Susan Smith was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Life behind bars. Susan has spent decades in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Reports from prison indicate a troubled time behind bars, including disciplinary issues and inappropriate relationships with prison guards. She has been cited for drug use, self-harm, and other rule violations. Despite this, Susan has occasionally reached out to the public, maintaining that she is remorseful and still struggles to come to terms with her actions. Her letters and interviews from prison have sparked widespread criticism, as many feel she has not truly accepted responsibility for her crimes. The parole hearing. In 2024, Susan Smith became eligible for parole after serving 30 years of her sentence. At the hearing, she expressed remorse for her actions and asked for a chance to re-enter society. She described her time in prison as a period of reflection and personal growth. However, the families of Michael and Alexander, as well as much of the public, strongly opposed her release. David Smith, the boys' father, delivered an emotional statement, urging the parole board to deny Susan's request. He spoke of the pain and loss he had endured and questioned whether Susan could ever be trusted outside the confines of prison. After deliberation, the parole board unanimously denied her request. Susan Smith will remain incarcerated and is not eligible for another parole hearing for several more years. A legacy of pain. Susan Smith's story is one of unimaginable tragedy and heartbreak. Her actions forever changed the lives of those around her and left a scar on the community of Union, South Carolina. Her case serves as a sobering reminder of the destructive power of lies and the devastating consequences of unresolved trauma. If you're fascinated by stories like this and want to explore the darker side of humanity, make sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Tales of True Crime and Dark Deception. Stay tuned for more gripping stories where we uncover the truths behind the lies.